Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, I rise today as a senior Senate Republican on the Joint Economic Committee to discuss, I think, one of the most fundamental issues that this body confronts on a year-to-year basis, or at least should confront on a year-to-year basis, and that is passing a budget off which we can operate through the rest of the year and measure how we spend hard-earned taxpayer dollars. Unfortunately, we haven't had one of these budgets for 4 years. I'm glad that we finally have arrived at this particular point, and I'll talk about that in more detail. Mr. President, a few years back, when I was serving as ambassador to Germany, I made calls on the various ministers. They would be equivalent to cabinet secretaries in our country. And I would always try to get a little background information on them before I went to see if we had anything in common or an icebreaker to start the conversation. So I was calling on one of the ministers and noticed, reading his background first, and noticed that his birth date was the same as mine. And it was a milestone birth date. We were both born in 1943, and at the time that was the date of my seeing him was just a couple months after we had both celebrated our 60th birthday. So to break the ice, I said to him, you know, Mr. Minister, we have something in common. And he said, what's that? And I said, well, we both were born on the same day. And therefore, we both reached a very important milestone in life. And he looked at me seriously and he said, and how are you doing with all this? And I said, well, I'm doing fine. I said, I don't feel any different. I don't think I think any different. It's almost as if the number is meaningless. And he looked at me seriously and said, you are in serious, major denial. This is a big deal. This is a major milestone. Well, ever since he said that, I've been wondering, gosh, you know, is that little pain in the right shoulder the beginning of more problems and so forth? But it reminded me of the situation that we faced here when others have come to the floor and either publicly on this floor or through the press or whatever have said, we don't have the debt problem that we have is not a major problem. We don't have a spending problem. Well, it reminded me of that minister who said, you have to be in major denial. Year after year, we are spending a lot more money than we take in, and there's no end in sight to that. Mandatory spending alone on programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security are projected to double in just a few years' time. It's estimated now that each new child being born today will inherit $50,000 or more of debt, which they will have to pay off as they grow, go through their education years and become part of our economy. They're going to have to be saddled with this ever-growing debt. So my three latest grandchildren, Grace, Charlie, and Avery, all young, just a few years old, are inheriting a very significant amount of debt that will saddle their opportunities and stifle their opportunities to participate in the American dream and to have the opportunities that many of my generation have had. Now, were interest rates not artificially held down by the Fed at historically low levels, we might also be facing our day of reckoning. I had the opportunity to talk with the Fed chairman some time back, and he indicated that, you know, we're kind of running out of tools here at the Fed to address these problems, and you people up the street that handle the fiscal issues, not the monetary issues, need to stand up and address the problem. And so when I think we all know that we can only keep interest rates low for so long. It's important to understand that a 1% point increase in interest rates would add over $1 trillion to the United States debt in just a 10-year period of time. And so these historically low rates are not going to stay historically low. They're going to rise as investors lose confidence in America's ability to pay off their debts in the future if we keep plunging into the level of debt and deficit spending that has been taking place here over the last several years. Eventually, we're going to reach that tipping point. And when we reach that tipping point, investors and consumers lose confidence. And when that happens, interest rates rise. And when interest rates rise, it impacts our economy in a very significantly negative way. All we have to do is look across the Atlantic at Europe and what's happening there to get a glimpse of the crisis that can come from not dealing with the ever-increasing debt and not taking the steps necessary over a period of time to put your country on a fiscal path to health. Now, I think most of us know here that we have to make some tough choices, and it's going to require political will in order for us to address this. We've been avoiding this for years, and we're going to face a debt-induced catastrophe if we don't address it and address it soon. So when you're faced with this kind of fiscal mess, what do? Well, what families and businesses all across America have had to do when they face these types of situations is sit down, create a budget, put themselves back on a path to balance and to prosperity and to avoid the inevitable collapse of the family budget or the business budget. Our communities and our states have had to do this, and we see this happening everywhere except in Washington. It is this body and this administration that has refused to step forward, number one, to pass a budget on which to guide our spending, but number two, to make the decisions necessary to turn this around and begin to put us on a better path and eventually a path to balance. Why a budget? Well, it helps us identify priorities. Sitting on the Appropriations Committee, when agency heads and secretaries come before us and present their requests for the future fiscal year in which we are making decisions, I ask each one of them, do you have a plan B? They said, what do you mean by plan B? I said, well, that plan, if we continue down this path that's going to ever shrink discretionary spending, and whether it's for cancer or paving roads or education or any other worthy project, there's going to be less money if we don't address the spending problem, particularly if we don't address mandatory spending. And I asked them, have you looked to do what every family's had to do, what every business has had to do during this 4 years of tepid growth and coming out of this recession, which just seems to linger and linger and linger, 23 million people out of work? Have you looked at ways in which you can make your spending and your administration of the budget which you oversee, can you make that more efficient and more effective? Are there things you can cut? Are there programs that you can eliminate that no longer are effective or perhaps shouldn't have been there in the first place? Are there things that you would like to do, but without the resources you're not able to do at this time, so you have to set them aside? So if the family is faced with lower revenue, or dad's job, his salary has been cut, or mom has lost her second job, or for whatever reason, they're having a hard time making payments to education for their children and mortgage payments and so forth, the family has to say, you know, we're going to have to look at how we spend money, and we're going to have to cut back. So maybe we won't be able to go to Disney World this year as we had planned. Maybe we need to buy a tent and go to the state park. Or maybe we need to do something less expensive. And kids with a credit card, we're going to have to put limits on that, or you're going to have to scale back. These are decisions that every family has had to make. These are decisions that every business owner has to face with and deal with, and they're doing that, but this is a decision that hasn't been made here. Well, 4 years, 1,400 and some days, 1,420, I think, and counting, when this body, the United States Senate, has not even passed a budget which would allow us to determine what our priorities are, at least give us a guidepost as to how we're going to spend money, and at least present to the American people who elected us to come here and represent them, at least tell them, give them the transparency of how we are spending their money. Finally, after 1,420 days, after 4 years, we have a budget before us. And while I'm pleased that that is the case, and I'm pleased that we're here debating that, it's disappointing when we learn what that budget offers. You would think after 4 years, and after the 4 years that we have been through, and the 23 million people unemployed or underemployed, and the rate of growth of this economy half of what it normally is, you would think that that budget being presented to us here would take some steps toward addressing our spending issues, and it would not incorporate $1 trillion or more of increased taxes, which will just simply go to more spending. How could we possibly support a budget with a $16.7 trillion debt that plunges us further into debt, with a staggering increase in debt, and also spending that doesn't reduce spending, but simply reduces the rate of growth of spending, which is a step, but nothing nearly appropriate to what we are facing. So this budget grows government. Let's not make any excuses. It grows government by increasing spending, and it grows government by a massive increase in taxes, just after we've had one a few months ago, and not counting the massive increase in taxes that's going to occur beginning in 2014 with the implementation of Obamacare. When we add that up and we look at the cost of that, we face a dire circumstance, and you would think that the budget being offered to us would not increase debt by 42%, but would address the real problem. Now, I know there's been a dispute about how much this budget revenue is, taxes are increased. Some say $1 trillion. Those that have presented the budget simply say, oh no, it's only $1 trillion. Well, whether it's $1.5 trillion or only a trillion, as if only $1 trillion in new taxes on the American people, after they just got hit with more than $500 billion 2 months ago, and are going to get hit with probably another $1 trillion in less than about 8 months as Obamacare kicks in. I mean, it just defies credibility, and I think the investment community and consumers and taxpayers all across America are going to look at this and say, what in the world are you doing? Now, what are the consequences of this? Well, the Heritage Foundation indicates that the Senate Democrats' budget would cost over 8 million jobs nationwide and 225,000 jobs in my own state over the next 10 years. They estimate that the budget would reduce economic output by $1.4 trillion and reduce private domestic investment by $820 billion. We don't know exactly if these figures are exact, but we should certainly see the trend here, and the trend is a negative consequence, not a positive consequence. So I think these statistics emphasize the fact that the entire mindset behind this budget seems to be, how can we find more revenue to fund more government spending, rather than how do we grow the economy? Our goal here ought to be grow the economy, not grow an already bloated government with more taxes to pay for more government spending. And this budget never balances the budget. We will never reach the point where our states have had to reach in balancing their budget. The majority of our states have had to pull themselves out of a hole, and they've done so because they are constitutionally mandated by their own state constitution to balance that budget. Families have to balance their budget, and businesses have to balance their budget. Only the federal government, and under this plan, never balances the budget. I've been coming to the Senate floor here for day after day after day this year, basically talking about the need for Republicans and Democrats and the President to come together with a bold, credible, and enforceable long-term plan to reduce our debt and put our country back on a path toward growth and prosperity. We need to recognize that it will take more than a quick fix. It's going to take more than this soap opera drama of kicking the can down the road, extending the decisions that we have to make for yet another few months behind this, behind that, or whatever. It's going to take the will to roll up our sleeves, stop wasting our time, and instead get to work on a plan that will deliver real results for the American people. To solve this dire situation and reduce dangerously high debt, I believe we need a plan that includes three major things. Reforming the way we spend. We need to go through each program at every agency and department and determine how we can do more with less. My colleague from Oklahoma, Tom Coburn, already has taken steps to triage our federal government spending by identifying programs that are ineffective, unnecessary, and overly duplicative. We need comprehensive tax reform. And the Joint Economic Committee has heard witnesses from the left, from the right, from the middle, nonpartisan, Republican, Democrat, independents. There is a consensus. If we don't have comprehensive tax reform together with a sensible, credible, long-term, enforceable spending plan, we will not pull ourselves out of this mess that we're in. The growth element of what we need comes through tax reform. Senator Wyden and I, in a bipartisan way, have worked years, and he worked years before that with former Senator Judd Gregg, in putting together a plan. We're not saying it's the be-all and end-all, but it forms the basis for a simplification of the tax code. It is revenue neutral. It addresses our lack of competitiveness around the world in terms of our corporate entities and businesses. It fixes rates at reasonable levels, and it ought to be the basis for at least the discussion in moving forward. But if we don't combine our spending discipline with a comprehensive tax reform, we're not going to have the element that can produce the growth, that will produce growth, which will produce the revenue, which will bring us more and closer to balance. And finally, I talk about this all the time, let's have the courage to address what we know is driving us into more and more deficit and will prevent us, if we don't adjust it, will prevent us from ever having a rational plan to get us out of this situation, and that's the mandatory spending. Let me quote from the President's own bipartisan commission. They said, and I quote, "By 2025, revenue will be able to finance only interest payments, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Every other federal government activity, cancer research, education, paving roads, air traffic control, meat inspectors, everything the government does that is of essential function for the federal government, not to mention national defense and homeland security. Every other function of the federal government will have to be paid for with borrowed money because our revenues will only pay for these few programs, which is eating up all of our expenditures. Debt, I go back to their statement, debt held by the public will outstrip the entire American economy, growing to as much as 185% of GDP by 2035. Interest on the debt could rise to nearly $1 trillion by 2020. That's just 6 years away. These mandatory payments, they said, which buy absolutely no goods or services, will squeeze out funding for all other priorities. So not only will the uncontrollable growth of mandatory spending squeeze out funding for all other programs or priorities in our country, but it'll also jeopardize the safety net that we have put in place for retirees who have worked hard and put money aside to become eligible when they retire for Social Security and Medicare, and for those who find themselves in a situation where Medicaid is a necessary safety net. We've always taken pride in being a country that is compassionate. We've been a place where if you work hard and earn a good living, you can earn a good living. You can raise a family. And then in later phases of life, you'll be able to rely on the safety net of health and retirement programs that you've invested in. But if we don't act on mandatory spending, if we don't act on Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, we will all but ensure the demise of these much-needed programs for future generations. Failing to act and leaving our children and grandchildren with this enormous debt burden is immoral. We all know, and we ought to know, or we ought to know by now, that our current path is unsustainable. Academics, economists, and business leaders from all sides of the political spectrum repeat the same thing. Unless we make the tough choices that we've been avoiding for years, we're going to face a debt-induced catastrophe. And it's only a matter of time, and the clock is running down. Congress and the President must summon the courage and the political will to do the right thing and take the tough medicine now that will heal this economy. What we've been doing for the last 2 years that I have been here is basically looking at a chronic illness and saying, take 2 Advil, maybe you'll feel better in the morning. That doesn't work. We need the bold, the credible, the enforceable plan that will put us on the path to prosperity, and it must include spending discipline, comprehensive tax reform, and mandatory spending reform. Mr. President, I'm going to be offering up to 5 amendments to this budget. I don't want to spend a great deal of time on this now. Let me just, for the record, mention the 5 that I'm going to offer. The first is a mandatory spending budget point of order. This would be a point of order against any legislation that increases the net level of mandatory spending at any time our gross federal debt exceeds 100% of the economy or our GDP. Numerous studies have said that when you reach 90%, you're at a tipping point, and it becomes historically proven that it has a negative impact, serious negative impact on your economy. I've raised this to 100% to allow a little room, and this point of order will be in place and can only be, if passed, it can only be overridden with 67 votes. This, I think, will force Congress to think before we act. Secondly, I'm offering an amendment. It's called transparency legislation, debt transparency. One of my colleagues and members of the House of Representatives, Luke Messer, has passed this in the House with bipartisan support, very significant bipartisan support. It simply requires the Congressional Budget Office to report annually an estimate of the cost per taxpayer of the deficit for any year that the President's budget is projected to be in deficit. The American people deserve to know this number, and this amendment would achieve that. I'm also offering an amendment to repeal the 3.8% tax on investment income. If you want to stifle the economy more, if you want to prevent more growth and slow down this economy, throw another tax in. On the very people who are providing the capital and the investment, yet another tax. And we just talked about the the medical device tax, which I have supported and working along with Democrat co-sponsor, Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota. Many others have joined this. Absolutely irresponsible tax, simply a pay-for the health care plan that taxes the very industry that is providing us revenues, high-paying jobs, and helping our trade balance by the quality of products that are exported overseas. This is crippling, and it's forcing some of these companies to look overseas because of this egregious surtax on top of all the other tax that they pay. And so I support Senator Hatch and Senator Klobuchar's amendment to repeal that medical device tax. I'm also offering an amendment designed to fix our broken and convoluted tax code. I see Senator Wyden has come to the floor. Senator Wyden and Senator Gregg started a heroic project several years ago to put together a comprehensive tax reform package. It's the work and the hours spent in pulling this together is amazing. And when Senator Gregg left the Senate, he called me and he said, this is something that I think you ought to take a look at, and perhaps you could take my place and work with Senator Wyden so that it could be a bipartisan effort going forward. We have discussed this with our colleagues. It should serve as the basis for tax reform, and as I said earlier in my remarks, we cannot address this problem without spending discipline and comprehensive tax reform combined, and all the witnesses that have come before us in the Joint Economic Committee have asserted this and enforced this. That is the necessary element to provide the growth to accompany the spending discipline, and then added to that the mandatory entitlement reform. And then finally, an EPA amendment, which working with my colleague, Senator Manchin, the Democrat, again, a bipartisan effort to deal with a particularly environmental EPA agency rule, but I won't go into the details of that. These will be some of the amendments that I will be offering in conjunction with my colleagues to hopefully make this budget a better piece of legislation. Just to conclude, Mr. President, it's been 4 years since the Senate has passed a budget. The plan before us, in my opinion, has not been worth the wait. It won't help generate more jobs for the more than 23 million Americans either unemployed or underemployed. It won't improve this slow economy. It won't save Medicare and Social Security from going broke. It won't produce a path to bipartisan comprehensive tax reform. It won't ever balance the budget. And it won't help hardworking Americans get back to work and get ahead in this life. We can do better than this. After 4 years of inaction, the American people deserve better than this plan. The American people elected a divided government. It was not a mandate for either party. It's a challenge, and a challenge that all of us need to accept. So let us act now. Let us summon the courage to stand up and work together on a truly balanced plan, not one that calls for ever more spending and ever higher taxes, but one that puts in place real reforms. The first step is passing a credible budget. Sadly, in my opinion, this budget doesn't match the need. And so hopefully we can make the adjustments to this to put us on that path to prosperity. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Washington.